It was hard to tell whether the eerie night was closer to dawn or dusk. The men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 were still rubbing the sleep from their eyes as the trucks rumbled down the dusty road. They did not know where they were going. They had been roused from their bunks just minutes earlier, and none seemed to understand why they had been given extra ammunition, with crates more in the trucks. The lower middle-class police officers, comprised of middle-aged men, had only been in Poland for 3 weeks. Nobody knew what to expect. The trucks finally stopped. Men stumbled out to discover the Polish village of Józef. Humble white houses with straw roofs sheltered at least 1,800 Jews. There was a dead silence as the men formed a semicircle around Major Wilhelm Trapp. The 53-year-old career policeman was well liked and respected among the men. They stood before him in military-like formation, with the captains at the head of their squads. None yet understood why he was pale and nervous, with a choking voice and pent-up tears. "Our battalion has to perform a frightfully unpleasant task," Major Trapp said to the 500 men before him. "This assignment is not to my liking. Indeed, it is highly regrettable. But the orders come from the highest authorities. If it makes it easier, remember that bombs fall on German women and children back home." Trapp cleared his throat, paused for a moment, and took a deep breath. It staggered in his chest. "These Jews have orchestrated an American boycott which has damaged the German economy. We have been ordered to find the Jews in Józef. The men of working age are to be separated and taken to a work camp. Those remaining, women, children, and the elderly, are to be shot." When Trapp fell silent, the world fell silent with him. Then he made an extraordinary offer. "If any of the older men among us do not feel up to the task required of them, please step forward." Of the 500 men present, nobody moved. Eventually, some heads began to turn. Otto Julius Mink of 3rd Company stepped forward. His captain began to berate him, furious that someone from his platoon was the first to break rank. Major Trapp immediately cut him off. The man turned in his rifle and awaited reassignment from the major. After the protection was made clear, 10 or perhaps 12 of the 500-man battalion followed suit. Those remaining were given assignments, surrounded the village, and followed their orders to perform the unthinkable. Thank you for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. I'm Mark Stanley, your host, and today we're going to look at a historical analysis of the grassroots killers employed by Hitler to carry out the Holocaust. But what makes our analysis different is that we are not going to examine it as a political phenomena, but as a psychological one. We want to look at what really happened in Nazi Germany, but not as a ho-hum historical overview or a violence and gore shock piece, but instead as a way to understand how ordinary men, people who are fundamentally the same as you and me, could carry out unspeakable atrocities. The invaluable wisdom that we shall discover is that those who commit atrocities are no less human than those who suffer atrocities. All of us are capable of great evil, and if we dismiss the perpetrators of the Holocaust as exceptionally wicked instead of exceptionally human, we will lose sight of our own capacity for evil, and are then at risk for compromising our promise to never forget. We must recognize our own capacity for evil if we are going to reject a naive view of ourselves and play a part, not only in the never forget, but also in the never again. But before we get into it, please go to our social media outlets on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Like, follow, and subscribe to support our project. Leave a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have benefited from the podcast or believe in our mission, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support our work on our website, wellreadchristian.com. You will also find interesting quotes, sources, articles, and more available free of charge. These are tough times for all of us, and if your contribution would cause any amount of financial pressure, please do not even consider it. But for those who are willing and able to give, it is because of your gift that the podcast can continue and grow. So thank you. All right, a lighthearted and fun episode today as we look at Christopher Browning's modern classic called Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland. And this work is important because it is a historical survey in line with perhaps Daniel Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners or other works of that sort, which highlight the fact that Hitler and his henchmen did not have enough time in the day to run around killing all the Jews and gypsies. We must remember that the mass murderers who were actually pulling the triggers were ordinary people. And what Christopher Browning does in his book is follow a reserve police battalion who were deployed to Poland during the German occupation of 1943, and he documents how these guys who had never shot a gun at someone before, these middle-aged men who were polite neighbors and good fathers, committed unspeakable atrocities. And the reason this specific reserve police battalion is so fascinating is because they aren't the indoctrinated youth of Hitler's Germany. These guys are lower middle class, older guys who were the friendly chaps next door back in Hamburg, a historically anti-Nazi city. But over the course of a year, given the right circumstances, became the most notorious unnamed mass murderers in history. So in our episode today, I'm going to tell you the story. What happened? I'm going to give you the facts. I'm going to give you the narrative, kind of like I did in the introduction. Then we're going to ask why it happened. And there's a debate that goes on in the halls of sociology and psychology as to how the Holocaust was even possible. Daniel Goldhagen basically sums it up as anti-Semitism and propaganda. He basically argues that because Nazi Germany was so anti-Semitic, it was really easy for Hitler to unleash genocide. Therefore, according to Goldhagen, it would be very hard for the circumstances to be just right for another Holocaust to occur. Others argue that the Holocaust can essentially be explained by sophisticated forms of peer pressure, top-down dominance. They argue that people will do anything if everyone else is doing it and it's ordered. Or maybe political power is actually far more powerful than anybody can imagine. If someone with a badge and a gun exerts more influence than previously thought possible, it makes sense how the Holocaust could reasonably occur. But it can't be right to simply say that the only factor is political power, because occasionally we see humane commanders like Major Trapp, who told his men that they didn't have to do it if they didn't want to, and he himself was very distressed over the whole thing. Perhaps if 400 men came forward instead of 12, history would remember Police Battalion 101 very differently. And if your theory of the Holocaust is just mustache man bad, mustache man made people do bad things, then you have a radically underanalyzed view of the facts. Here's a quote from Christopher Browning. Quote, "Ultimately, the Holocaust took place because at the most basic level, individual human beings killed other human beings in large numbers over an extended period of time. The grassroots perpetrators became professional killers." End quote. Christopher Browning ultimately thinks that any one-dimension explanation of the Holocaust is inadequate because human beings are multi-layered and complicated. But when the rubber meets the road, you can't just hand-wave away what happened in the 1940s as radical anti-Semitism or role adaptation or any of these things. At some point, you have to wrestle with the fact that it was relatively easy for ordinary men to become state-sponsored mass murderers. And then finally, after I give you the facts and offer some competing interpretations, we'll conclude by considering the importance of moral integrity, something Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust, whose works we'll talk about very soon, stressed constantly. How do you make sure that if you found yourself in a situation where everyone around you was doing something terrible, and it took great courage and strength to hold yourself back, how do you make sure that you are part of the 1 in 5,000 who do something like that? People often read history and think, well, yeah, that was someone else. If I had been there, I would have resisted. I would have rallied the comrades to resist Hitler's orders. Well, think again, buddy, because statistically speaking, the overwhelming odds are that you would not only have been complicit in murder like everyone else, but you may have actually enjoyed it, like some of the men grew to do. And if you can't even go against the grain to not gossip when the occasion arises, and the cost is potential short-term embarrassment from your peers, then what makes you think you would become a moral hero if your life and the life of your family was on the line, like in many cases it was in Nazi Germany? People constantly judge their own character by the things they do and the things they don't do, but that's a mistake. You should also judge your character based on what you would do if the circumstances allowed, or what you would do if circumstances forced their hands. You can't just judge yourself based on what actually happens in your life. Perhaps you will never find a good opportunity to do something that you would otherwise do if the circumstance arose, or otherwise pushed you. Who would you be in Nazi Germany? Would you have the stomach, the courage, and the guts to put your life on the line, your family's life on the line, to do the right thing? What we're about to discover is that most of these guys weren't even willing to put their reputations on the line to do the right thing. They were more concerned with their career and their retirement funds than what was happening to the people they were butchering. And don't assume that you would have been any different than them. Abortion clinics kill 3,000 babies a day, and most of us sleep pretty soundly. Most of us won't lift a finger to do the right thing in just our interpersonal relationships, let alone massive scales where lives are on the line. Well, I'm getting carried away, so let's talk about the facts. Reserve Police Battalion 101 was transferred from Hamburg to Germany-occupied Poland to police the occupied territory during the war. Their more significant task, however, was to travel the Polish countryside, hunting and slaughtering the Jews in their path. The first town to suffer such a fate was Józef. The introduction to the story has already been told. The final solution in Józef was carried out inefficiently and to everyone's horror. After the executions began, individual policemen remember seeing Major Trapp emotionally devastated about what was happening. He often retreated to his private quarters to weep uncontrollably. One man remembered hearing the major repeat to himself, "Orders are orders, but such jobs do not suit me." He later confided in his driver that, "If this Jewish business is ever avenged on earth, have mercy on us Germans." Many of the men resented Major Trapp for being unwilling to watch the killings himself. But you couldn't really escape them either. One policeman noted that the town was small enough to where you could hear every gunshot and every scream. In the investigations and trials after the war was over, only 2 men of the 500 actually admitted to killing Jews this first time at Józef. The rest merely said they saw bodies. The point of least agreement among witnesses was the treatment of children and infants. Some said that they were killed and left in the streets like everyone else. Most, however, said that very few had the heart to kill a child in front of their mother. They instead were taken to the town square to be marched into the forest where the mass graves were being dug. Only the most cruel among them could pull the trigger on a small child, as they were ordered to do. In the woods nearby, the battalion doctor was instructing the firing squads where precisely to shoot the victims in the spine to provide instant death. Victims would lie down in mass graves and be shot, while new victims were stacked on top of the old ones. After hours of killing, most executioners lost track of how many they had killed, but it took all day. Crates of alcohol were brought by the afternoon for the shooters to drink. As the town was emptied of Jews, some men tried to get out of joining their comrades in the forest. One man pleaded with his captain that he too was a father and could not do it. He was assigned to guard duty. A handful of men lingered in the town, pretending to search for stragglers while really just fearing being assigned to another firing squad. When they thought their absence might be noted, they began helping load Jewish prisoners into trucks bound for concentration camps. Anything to get out of pulling the trigger. The Jewish men of working age wept while being loaded into the trucks. They knew what was happening in the woods. After hours of killing, an entire squad told Captain Wolff that they couldn't continue. Wolff said that if they didn't like it, they could lay down with the victims. A few hours later, a few persistent men approached the captain again and were sent to Major Trapp, who relieved them of duty for the day. Officers with submachine guns eventually had to regularly offer mercy kills. Some men in the firing squads began shaking uncontrollably. Others began missing intentionally. Still others found opportunities to slip away and just be alone in the forest. As night began to fall, it was clear that the killings were not going fast enough. Officers began finding ways to expedite the process or push their men to work faster. Eventually, everyone was rotating in and out of the firing squad to allow smoke breaks. Uniforms were splattered with blood, chunks of skull and brain matter. The confusion of the rotations gave more men the chance to sneak off and meander by the trucks or the marketplace. Finally, by 9 p.m., the last of the Jews had been taken away to the concentration camps or killed in the forests near Józef. If they hadn't finished their business soon, they would have run out of space in the woods to execute any more victims. Just when they thought it was all over, a 10-year-old girl appeared, bleeding from the head and crying. She was brought to Major Trapp, who scooped her up and consoled her. He said, "Not this one shall live." No documentation exists as to what became of her. That night, when the men finally returned to the barracks, few men ate anything, but everyone drank heavily. They were depressed, angry, bitter, and shaken. Some had new watches or wallets, necklaces and rings. Most just had a dirty uniform. Major Trapp tried to console his men by reminding them that orders were orders, and there was nothing that they could do. He encouraged them to not think about it, but that was already an unspoken consensus. This slaughter would be the first of many. Although reflection could be repressed during the day, that night almost every man reported experiencing night terrors. One man even bolted awake, firing his gun at the ceiling, which awoke everyone else in the barracks. After the war, when Allied interrogators investigated the war crimes of these policemen, it can be ascertained that roughly 20% either avoided shooting or were relieved of the obligation after experiencing physical revulsions. Almost none cited moral or political ideals for their refusal to murder, but merely a weak stomach and inability to carry on. Browning notes that perhaps it would be unfair to expect these uneducated middle-aged men to wax poetically about abstract principles during their interrogations, but their answers are nonetheless revealing. Among the reasons why they were willing to participate in the executions, Christopher Browning offers 5 general answers that the men gave. Number 1, lack of time to reflect. Almost everyone said that they didn't remember the part of the speech where Major Trapp offered a chance to turn in their carbines and sit it out. The majority said that they didn't even register what was going on until it was over, and only years later did they see that it was immoral. Simply put, the men suppressed their consciences immediately and were given alcohol and silence to assist in that suppression. Number 2, pressure for conformity from superiors and peers. Obviously, there was an immediate pressure from superiors as well as comrades to do their jobs and do it well. Every Jew you didn't kill was one that your brother in arms did have to kill, so take your share of the dirty work and get it done. Number 3, fear of being considered a coward. Of those who did sneak away and linger by the trucks, they were insulted, berated, and mocked incessantly. The human conscience, which demands that it be put on a pedestal for doing the right thing, caused many men to call those who withheld their trigger fingers all kinds of names. Being ostracized for weakness became normal, and many complied just to avoid this kind of treatment. Number 4, the Jews would die anyways. A common rationalization that many men reported was that even if they specifically didn't pull the trigger, someone else would. Why be a hero if it won't actually amount to anything? If the Jews are going to die anyway, there's no point in being the one guy who is a conscientious objector. May as well just get on with it. One man even said that he preferred to kill children rather than mothers, because once the family was dead, he considered it a mercy to the children. Number 5, it would hurt their career. Many of these guys had been policemen their entire lives. After this whole ordeal, they planned on going home and resuming their careers. If their refusal to participate meant shame or disapproval, it could seriously damage the prospects of promotion or retirement. The notable exception among the men's rationalizations was anti-Semitism. Hardly anyone cited a specific distaste for the Jews as motivation for their killing. As a matter of fact, many people said that they weren't specifically racist at all. Some even said that they liked the Jews, that they had Jewish friends back home. But Jews were cast as enemies, just like Americans or Russians, but perhaps as a more subversive and parasitical kind that deserved a special kind of horrific treatment. After Josephau, it was clear to the German authorities that concentration camps would be better than field executions to preserve the morale of the troops. But over the next few weeks of performing mass deportations to concentration camps, policing Jewish ghettos, and brutally policing the Polish population, the battalions were growing accustomed to the final solution in Poland. The next slaughter at Lamazi, performed a month later, wasn't as traumatic for the men. They had already become accustomed to the killing. This time, SS officers oversaw the operation. Major Trapp did not offer the choice of sitting the day out, which honestly only made it easier for the men to rationalize that they had no choice. Trapp's offer to guilty consciences had to be buried deeper than the graves they were filling. At first, only the SS formed firing squads, while the police battalion merely rounded up and escorted the Jews. But once the SS forces were too drunk to keep firing, the police battalion began rotating in, equally sharing the burden amongst themselves. Because there were less troops available and more Jews to kill, and SS officers were present, there was more pressure to be brutal, quick, and relentless. This process eventually became the norm. After the massacre at Josephau and Lamazi, Reserve Police Battalion 101 would take part in 11 more massacres over the next 3 months, totaling the murder of 38,000 Jews. These numbers are based on the records of the Nazis themselves, who were reporting back to the highest echelons of the Third Reich. At first, they would differentiate between the amount of men, women, and children killed. This distinction quickly faded as it was too cumbersome to note. The procedure for the battalion became routine. They would go into a city and tell every Jew to go to the marketplace or town square. Those who couldn't go would be shot on sight. Then they would be moved to the forest in groups of 200 to 300. The able-bodied men would dig a mass grave, then watch as their neighbors were put in them and shot. The graves would fill with blood until bodies floated. Then the Jewish men would bury the graves over and be shot themselves. Mercy kills were seldom granted to save ammo if the first shot didn't kill its target. Captain Wolof, who you may recall for telling his men that they could join the victims if they couldn't pull the trigger, asked for leave to marry his 4-month pregnant girlfriend. He then enjoyed a short honeymoon before bringing his girl to the slaughter of Minzijets. Wolof wanted to impress his woman by showing her his command over Jewish life and death, but his men were very disgruntled at having to perform their heinous duties in front of a lady. Some men were revealed to be sadists, even growing to enjoy their work, such as Lieutenant Nade. Others were disgusted with his sadism. It was standard protocol to wait to shoot until the alcohol arrived. On one occasion, a traveling German military entertainment group had heard about the Jew killings and wanted to take part in it, thinking it was cool or manly. When the police battalion obliged, gave them a gun, and put them in front of Jewish children, 4 of them changed their minds and were shaken to the core. As the months drug on, some men became physically ill due to the pressure and the guilt. Captain Hoffman is an example of such a man, and even though he exhibited real symptoms and was excused from duty by the doctor, many men hated him and considered him a coward, thinking his symptoms were psychologically induced. On November 2, 1942, Reserve Police Battalion 101 took part of the largest mass killing operation during the war, with a body count of 42,000 victims in the Lublin district. The incident was called the Harvest Festival. Over the course of a few days, the battalion forced able-bodied men to dig graves, which they said were trenches for the impending Russian advance. Then, on November 3rd, after cutting the phone lines and surrounding the city, they blared music over loudspeakers in an unsuccessful attempt to hide the sound of the firing squads, as thousands of Jews were escorted from all corners of the city to the trenches they had dug to be executed and buried. The massacre at Joseph was in July of 1942. By November of the same year, Reserve Police Battalion 101 had become hardened mass murderers. A regular part of their duties included what they called the Jew hunt. They joked about eating Jew brains. One day, a wife of an officer was visiting and overheard one of the men say that he hadn't yet eaten his daily bread. That meant he hadn't killed a Jew that day. She called him a scoundrel, and her husband had to reprimand her. Recruiting for Jew hunts became volunteer-based. The men were divided between the weak, who always got out of it by volunteering for latrine cleaning or sentry duty. Otherwise, they would pretend they had bad aim and constantly missed their shots. Others became the hardened, who learned to adapt to their environment and overcome their consciences. These men volunteered to go on Jew hunts and were able to joke about it as if they were doing any other job. Otto Julius Mink, who you may recall as the first to take advantage of Major Trapp's offer of recusing himself from the murderous duties at Joseph, was never selected for Jew hunts. He was very outspoken about his distaste for killing Jews, and being bold freed him from being assigned to Jew hunting expeditions because everyone knew he just wouldn't go. He once punched a fellow policeman for clubbing a woman right in front of him. He was punished by Sunday duties and overtime sentry duty. Other men also acquired a similar reputation of being weak. They were not even seen as men, but they were also not assigned to firing squads. Christopher Browning notes that, quote, "Though the Jew hunt has received little attention, it was an important and statistically significant phase of the final solution. A not inconsiderable percentage of Jewish victims in the general government lost their lives this way. Statistics aside, the Jew hunt is a psychologically important key to the mentality of the perpetrators. Many of the German occupiers in Poland may have witnessed or participated in general roundups on several occasions. In a lifetime, a few brief moments that could easily be repressed. But the Jew hunt was not a brief episode. It was a tenacious, remorseless, and ongoing campaign in which the hunters tracked down and killed their prey in direct and personal confrontation. It was not a passing phase, but an existential condition of constant readiness and intention to kill every last Jew who could be found." End quote. The policemen exhibited creativity with their trade. Sometimes they would sneak up on Jewish farms. Other times they would burst in and kill them all with submachine guns. Sometimes men were ordered to go to specific areas to kill people they knew personally. On these occasions, men would approach kindly and engage in conversation before shooting their victims from behind. This unexpected death was considered merciful. In total, Reserve Police Battalion 101 is responsible for killing 38,000 Jews and deporting 45,000 more to death camps over the course of 10 months from 1942 to 1943. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what happened? How is this possible? How could this sort of a thing occur? And people always are saying in reference to the Holocaust, never forget. We see that everywhere, in every Holocaust museum around the world. Never forget. But what does that mean? Well, what it means is, don't forget that this actually happened and could happen again. So what's the lesson? The lesson is that the Nazi killers were ordinary people. It's not an easy us versus them box that you can just compartmentalize them in. You can't just say, well, some people are moral monsters. No. Everyone has the capacity to be that moral monster. If you were in Germany during the 1930s, the likelihood that you would have been a Nazi is overwhelming. What makes you think that you're different? That you would have been Oskar Schindler or perhaps Anne Frank? The truth is that the people who perpetrated the Holocaust were ordinary people who came from a largely Judeo-Christian cultured background, were well-educated, were well-off, at least thanks to Hitler's control and support and power. And that's the lesson of this book. On paper, the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 would not have appeared to make promising recruits for Jew hunters. They were not indoctrinated psychopaths. They had a humane commander. They were not exceptionally racist. They came from an area of Germany, Hamburg, which was pretty much anti-Nazi. At least they had anti-Nazi roots that went deep. The reason they became killers was because of their own ordinary, all-too-human capacity for evil. They resigned themselves to self-pity and a dull conscience through drink and lack of reflection, passing moral responsibility to their legitimate authorities who were giving the orders. They were not strong enough to stand up to the social pressures, and that 20% at first who couldn't pull the trigger, they became professional mass murderers within the month. If you've been a long-time listener, you might remember our first episode where we talked about Tolstoy's War and Peace. Tolstoy was such an incredible figure. He saw this problem, and I talked about it in episode 1, I think also in episode 4. He saw that most people think that political power is far more than it really is. When the French marched east and butchered, plundered, and raped all the way to Moscow, most people accepted that this happened because Napoleon pushed hot air out of his mouth, and the syllables that this man utters commands the future. But Tolstoy said, that's not a good enough explanation. How does one man's tongue cause hundreds of thousands of soldiers to murder, rape, and pillage? And his conclusion is that there are forces beyond ourselves which we don't understand, which cause these sorts of things, which historians have yet to even fathom. Christopher Browning is one such historian who is trying to investigate these forces. How can the noises of Hitler, which became the noises of Major Trapp, eventually become the mass killings in Poland? How does that happen? And the answer is not racism. It's not that Hitler or Trapp or Wolof are demigods and can control other people. It's that at an individual level, each man in that battalion found it easier to go along with what everyone else was doing rather than risk their own reputations or careers or lives. Each man in the battalion did not have the moral fortitude to act according to their conscience and instead preferred to become mass murderers. And they, along with everyone else in Nazi Germany, compromised their consciences to the point where it could not lead them anymore which way was up and which way was down. And so when the chips were down, they didn't have anything to guide them. People can't just start disappearing from your population without natural questions arising in your conscience. Hitler began clearing out mentally disabled people among the German population first. But instead of asking questions about where all the Jews are disappearing to, they just suppressed it. And that's how it happens. You compromise your conscience in little ways. You just don't ask questions. Just keep your head down. And eventually, you don't know what you're supposed to do. And that's why you must listen to your conscience and strengthen it. You cannot allow yourself to compromise in those little ways. Otherwise, your conscience can't guide you when you desperately need it to. There's another author who Browning talks a lot about. His name is Daniel Goldhagen. And Goldhagen wrote a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners, where he talks about how Hitler was able to recruit people who were willing to perform atrocious deeds. So it's very similar to Browning's work in that sense. Except Goldhagen traces everything that went wrong in Nazi Germany to their long-standing anti-Semitism and Hitler's propaganda. He insists that Germany was so corrupted by racism and evil that all Hitler really had to do was let it loose. But there's a fundamental problem with Goldhagen's view. Goldhagen insists that all German cruelty against Jews can be boiled down to racism and propaganda. But as we have seen, the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 were not exceptionally anti-Semitic, nor were they young enough to be dramatically impacted by the propaganda machine. Plus, we have seen even worse cruelty in the Romanian killings, or the Croatian killings, or the communist genocides in Cambodia and Rwanda. Browning cites the psychologist Erwin Staub from the University of Massachusetts, who says, quote, "Ordinary psychological processes and normal, common human motivations and certain basic, but not inevitable, tendencies in human thought and feeling are the primary sources of the human capacity for mass destruction of human life. Evil that arises out of ordinary thinking and is committed by ordinary people is the norm, not the exception." Another thing that thinkers such as John Dower try to point out is that war brings with it certain brutalizations and racism which can induce war crimes. While Browning doesn't disagree with most of his conclusions, he again emphasizes that what happened in Germany gives us an even more sobering picture of what human beings are capable of. These men were not brutalized by the loss of comrades. They were not experiencing the pressure of being shot at by an enemy. They did not lose friends and brothers. They didn't have the frenzy of a battlefield at all times. They were not feeling embittered by war or resentful towards their enemy. The Jew hunt was a calm and calculated game of cat and mouse. It wasn't a spur of the moment. It wasn't guided by hatred or passion. It was systematic and cold. Theodor Adorno has suggested that authoritarian regimes bring out the worst kinds of people to become cruel soldiers and enforcers and such. Similarly, Zygmunt Bauman argues that, quote, "Nazism was cruel because Nazis were cruel, and the Nazis were cruel because cruel people tended to become Nazis," end quote. Sort of a self-selection idea in his writings. But none of Police Battalion 101 were party members. None were exceptionally cruel before performing their duties in Poland. They were just average guys. But that's the lesson of the Holocaust. Average guys are capable of this because cruelty doesn't come from the government. It comes from you. You and I could have been a guard at Auschwitz if circumstances were different. And you might be terrified to find out that you could enjoy the rush that comes from power or the thrill from violence. And if you don't know that about yourself, you're naive. Each of us have seeds of profound evil and unspeakable atrocities that we're capable of. And not just the horrors of the genocide, but everyday evil that we're so accustomed to, we don't even notice. Our own fantasies or our own lusts or our own, if-onlys. We don't notice our own capacity for cruelty or savagery. And if you don't believe this, then you have not paid enough attention to yourself. You have not paid enough attention to the emotions that rise up in tense situations or the thoughts that cross through your mind at moments that you don't even remember. At the end of the day, the Holocaust didn't happen because a lunatic took power. The Holocaust happened because at the most basic level, individual people killed other people en masse over an extended period of time. And this was able to occur because we, as human beings, value our reputations, our careers, and our comforts over anything else, including the lives of others, unless we foster integrity and character. We are often unwilling to come to terms with this because improving our character is hard work. It's easy to compromise your conscience, and it's painful to understand your capacity for evil. But this is the lesson of the 20th century. The lesson is that human beings are capable of great evil, not as an accident of culture or racism or external factors, but because ordinary people like you and me won't be bothered to overcome corrupt moral norms or confront the evil in our own souls. I will end with a quote from Browning. Quote, "Why does it matter which of our portrayals and conclusions about Reserve Police Battalion 101 are closer to the truth? It would be very comforting if Goldhagen were correct, that very few societies have the long-term cultural cognitive prerequisites to commit genocide, and that regimes that can only do so when the population is overwhelmingly of one mind about its priority, justice, and necessity. We would live in a safer world if he were right, but I am not so optimistic. I fear that we live in a world in which war and racism are ubiquitous, in which the powers of government mobilization and legitimization are powerful and increasing, in which a sense of moral responsibility is increasingly attenuated by specialization and bureaucratization, and in which the peer group exerts tremendous pressures on behavior and sets moral norms. In such a world, I fear, modern governments that wish to commit mass murder will seldom fail in their efforts for being able to induce ordinary men to become their willing executioners." Thank you for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. Captain Wolof, who you may recall for refusing to allow his men to resign their duties at Josephow, asked for leave to marry his 4-month-old... No, not his 4-month-old pregnant... Oh, dear.